The topic of this lecture is the respiratory system. The respiratory system basically consists of the lungs and the associated airways. Key role of the respiratory system is to facilitate gas exchange in the body. Before we look at the specific structures of the respiratory system, we need to consider why we need a respiratory system at all. Well, the cells of our body must be able to perform work to sustain life. This work can be internal work, such as the chemical reactions that occur inside cells that are important for sustaining life. For example, a requirement to pump ions across the cell membrane. Our body also needs to perform external work that we might, for example, associate with movement of the musculoskeletal system. Cells in our body produce a material called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. This is a very important molecule. It acts like an energy shuttle. It transports the chemical energy that we derive from our nutrients to areas within the cell where that energy can be used to drive certain processes. To produce enough ATP to service our energy needs, we require the presence of oxygen, and it is the respiratory system that contains the structures which will facilitate our ability to obtain that oxygen. Specifically, the respiratory system will allow the exchange of gases between the blood and the air. When looking at the respiratory system, we can view the anatomical structures and can focus on those, or we can focus on the functional properties of the respiratory system. If we're examining just the anatomy of the respiratory system, we tend to look at upper respiratory tract structures and the lower respiratory tract structures, which we'll see in the next image. We can also consider the structures of the respiratory system in a functional context. If we do this, we can break it up into two basic divisions. Structures of the respiratory system that conduct air, that allow the movement of air from the mouth to the areas where gas exchange can occur. Conducting portions are listed here and include such things as the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, and the other associated airways. The other major functional part of the respiratory system is the respiratory portion. This is where the gas exchange will occur. So oxygen from the air will enter the bloodstream. The other thing that will be happening is carbon dioxide from the blood. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular metabolism. That will be able to move from the blood to the air and be gotten rid of. A major structure that's important in the respiratory portion are the alveoli, and we'll look at these later. This highlights the upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract structures. We can see the upper respiratory tract structures here. We have a range of structures that we'll be looking at today, such as the nasal cavity, sinuses, the pharynx, commonly referred to as the throat. Then we get down to the lower respiratory tract structures, things like the larynx, trachea, the associated airways within the lungs themselves, and accessory structures such as the pleura. So let's begin our examination of the structural features of the respiratory system. The first of these is the nose. We'll start here because this is where the air enters the respiratory system. The nose is formed by two major regions. We have the external nose and the internal nose. We'll focus primarily on the internal nose. The external nose is what is visible anteriorly, and that's seen here. This is formed mostly by bones such as the maxilla and the two nasal bones, and also by cartilage, in particular hyaline cartilage, that allows the nose to be flexible but still maintain its shape. We'll focus most of our attention on the internal nose, and in particular we'll be looking at the nasal cavity, a cavity behind the external nose. This cavity is partitioned into left and right portions by a vertical curtain made of bone and cartilage we call the nasal septum. Air enters the nasal cavity by external nares or nostrils, and within the nasal cavity you'll find portions that are associated with our sense of smell, and I'll highlight those as we're progressing through this lecture. Here we have a good image which highlights the location of the nasal cavity. So we have our external nose here. Posterior to that we can see this cavity, nasal cavity. Over here we have some of the details of that nasal cavity. Notice here the superior aspect of it. There is a region which is called the olfactory region. This is associated with the sense of smell. There will be receptors for the sense of smell located here. The other regions here are the respiratory regions, and this is primarily involved with the processing of air. Take note of these curved structures here, conchae. These are curved projections of bone on the lateral aspects of the nasal cavity, 3 of them on each side. This summarizes some of the details that I've just been talking about. Within the nasal cavity, on the lateral aspects of the cavity, both the left and right side, there are projections of bone that curve down. These are called conchae. What these do is create turbulence as air flows into the nasal cavity. That is important for allowing the air to be warmed, humidified and cleaned before it's moved further into the respiratory system. Beneath each of these curved projections is a groove-like structure we call a meatus. This is just summarizing the olfactory epithelium in the olfactory regions, which I mentioned previously. On the superior nasal conchae and the septum of the olfactory regions, you will find areas where the receptors for the sense of smell are located. So olfactory is a reference to the sense of smell. The only structure which wasn't indicated in the previous diagram was the nasal septum, the curtain of bone and cartilage that separates the nasal cavity into right and left halves. This image here highlights the conchae and the meatuses that I spoke of previously. So on the lateral aspects of the right and left side of the nasal cavity are 3 curved bony projections. Conchae, we have a superior one, a middle one and an inferior one. Beneath each of those is a groove-like structure we call a meatus, superior, middle and inferior meatus. Now look at what's happening here with the lines that I'm showing you now. That is representing the flow of air coming into the nasal cavity, and what you can see is that the air is channeled over these conchae and through these grooves, the meatuses. That will create turbulence, and as the air is swirling around, there's the opportunity to warm it up, to humidify it and to remove materials such as dust and pathogens that you don't want going further into the respiratory system. This slide highlights the other structure of the nasal cavity that we couldn't see in the previous figure. This is the nasal septum, a median partition of the nasal cavity, visible here in this opening of the skull here. We can see the left and right sections of the nasal cavity, and dividing them is this curtain of bone and hyaline cartilage. Bones that contribute to that are shown here: ethmoid bone, vomer, palatine bone, and in here we have hyaline cartilage. Now it's worth mentioning that in the models that you look at in the anatomy practicals, most of them which show the nasal cavity have removed the nasal septum, so it's often difficult to find an example of this in the models we look at. This slide here shows a CT scan of an individual who has received trauma to their nose, and as a consequence the nasal septum has become severely deviated. There we go, that should go straight up and down, but as you can see here, the trauma has caused a major deviation of it that will have to be corrected by surgery. The next structures I'll focus on are also associated with the nasal cavity. These are the paranasal sinuses. Bones of the skull which surround the nasal cavity, many of them have air spaces within them. The air spaces are called sinuses, and they are linked, connected to the nasal cavity. Air in the nasal cavity has the capacity to enter these sinuses, where once again it can be warmed and humidified. Sinuses also help to lighten the skull. Sinuses are named according to the bones in which they are located. So we can have frontal sinuses in the frontal bone, maxillary sinuses in the maxilla, and so on. So there are sinuses in the frontal bone, maxilla, ethmoid bone and sphenoid bone. The numbers are indicated here. Over here we have the detail relating to how these sinuses connect to the nasal cavity. This shows the location of the paranasal sinuses in the bones of the skull that surround the nasal cavity. So here within the frontal bone, we have the frontal sinuses, which is typically 2 but can be more. Typically there are also 2 maxillary sinuses in the maxilla. There are also a couple of sinuses in the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone has many small air spaces, so there are many ethmoid sinuses. Over here we have the ethmoid bone. You can see the air spaces here. The other thing you can see is the perpendicular plate that contributes to the nasal septum, and you can also see the conchae, the superior and middle conchae, which are formed by the ethmoid bone. From the nasal cavity, we progress now to the pharynx, commonly referred to as the throat. It's an upper respiratory tract structure, and it can be associated with not just the respiratory system, but the digestive system as well. So in some regions, we have food, liquid, and air that will move through it. So the pharynx, commonly referred to as the throat, consists of 3 adjoining regions. Nasopharynx is the most superior one, starts posterior to the nasal cavity. Oropharynx is inferior to that, it's posterior to the oral cavity, and the Laryngopharynx is the most inferior regions of the pharynx, and it is posterior to the larynx. I'll briefly look at these regions now. The nasopharynx, the most superior region of the pharynx, is located posterior to the nasal cavity and superior to the soft palate. The soft palate is important for providing a valve system to prevent material moving into the nasal cavity, and we'll speak about that in a minute or two. This is purely associated with the respiratory system, the nasopharynx. Food and liquid should never go in here. Food and liquid is blocked from entering this structure by the soft palate that elevates during the swallowing process, and we'll have an image of that later. The lateral walls of the nasopharynx have openings for auditory tubes which connect to the middle ear, and it helps equalize the air pressure between the middle ear and the air itself, and that allows you to hear better. You will also find a single pharyngeal tonsil in the nasopharynx, referred to as the adenoids, and as we spoke about in the previous lymphatic lecture, the tonsils are involved in helping provide immunity from infectious microorganisms that may have entered via the airways. Here we can see the nasopharynx posterior to the nasal cavity, the adenoids here, the pharyngeal tonsil up here, and we also have one of the openings to the middle ear. There'll be another one on the other side. This helps equalize the air pressure between the middle ear and the nasal cavity. The soft palate is indicated here, and this will move up and close the entrance to the nasal cavity when you swallow liquid or food. The next region of the pharynx is the oropharynx, inferior to the nasopharynx. It's posterior to the oral cavity, and inferiorly it's marked by the hyoid bone. So the hyoid bone, the level of that, marks the level at which the oropharynx stops. There are 2 pairs of muscular arches that form the entrance from the oral cavity into this structure. It also contains tonsils, the palatine tonsils. Inferior to the oropharynx is the laryngopharynx. It extends inferiorly from the hyoid bone, that is about at the level of cervical vertebra number 3, and it's continuous with the larynx and esophagus. The laryngopharynx terminates at the superior border of the esophagus. We're about the level of cervical vertebra number 6, and it's posterior to the larynx. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx allow the passage of food, liquid, and air. Now we'll move to some of the lower respiratory tract structures. We'll move towards the larynx. This is inferior to the pharynx, and unlike the pharynx, this is solely set up to allow the conduction of air. Food and liquid should not enter this structure. The larynx is what we commonly refer to as the voice box, and it's indicated here. Short cylindrical structure bounded posteriorly by the laryngopharynx that we were talking about previously. This structure is suspended from a small horseshoe-shaped bone called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a bit unusual in that it doesn't directly articulate with any other bone of the skeleton. The hyoid bone is found at about the level of the 6th cervical vertebra. The walls of the larynx are reinforced by plates of cartilage. There are 9 of these. There are 3 individual pieces and 3 pairs of hyaline cartilage. The larynx also has structures that prevent the entry of food or liquid into the airways, and it is in the larynx that sound production occurs. This is where our voice emanates from. As I mentioned previously, the walls of the larynx are reinforced by discrete cartilage structures. The majority of these are formed from hyaline cartilage, but there is one formed from another type of cartilage we call elastic cartilage, and I'll go through the main ones now. The largest of the cartilages of the larynx are the 3 single pieces of cartilage. The biggest one is the thyroid cartilage. This has a distinct anterior prominence, the laryngeal prominence, which we refer to as the Adam's apple. Typically that's larger in males. This is composed of hyaline cartilage. Inferior to that is the cricoid cartilage, and once again that is composed of hyaline cartilage. The epiglottic cartilage attaches to the posterior aspect of the thyroid cartilage, and it is made of elastic cartilage. The epiglottis acts as a safety valve to close the top of the larynx over the hole we call the glottis and prevent the entry of food or liquid into the airways. This shows the 3 individual cartilage pieces that I've just spoken about. Before we go any further, I'll just draw your attention to this horseshoe structure here. This is the hyoid bone at the level of about cervical vertebra number 6, and it is from this that the larynx is suspended. We have a membrane here, a fibrous membrane, and beneath that we have the largest of the cartilages of the larynx, the thyroid cartilage. This region here is the laryngeal prominence, commonly referred to as the Adam's apple. Inferior to our thyroid cartilage is the cricoid cartilage, once again composed of hyaline cartilage. Over here, posterior to the hyoid bone, is the epiglottis or epiglottic cartilage made of elastic cartilage, and this will close over the entrance to the larynx and prevent the entry of food or liquid into the airways. The posterior aspect of the larynx is characterized by the presence of 3 small cartilage pairs. I've just shown one of these, the Rytenoid Cartilages, but there are more than that. There are actually 3 on each side, and we're just focusing here on the arytenoid, which is the largest of the cartilage pairs. The Rytenoid Cartilages, triangular shaped cartilage segments made of hyaline cartilage, and what you will find with these smaller cartilage pairs is that they will help move structures such as the true and false vocal cords. The false vocal cords help close up the entrance to the larynx, whereas the true vocal cords are involved in producing sound. So those cords will be attached to these cartilage pairs, and there will be muscles here as well that will help move the cords and carry out whatever function is required of them. That introduces us to the concept of sound production in the larynx. We have ligaments within the larynx. We have an inferior pair of ligaments. These are the true vocal cords. These are the ones that produce sound. The tension, length and position of these ligaments is determined by muscles which are attached to those cartilage pairs that I showed you previously. These ligaments will vibrate as air passes over them and produce sound. The opening through which the air moves is referred to as the glottis. Now, as well as the true vocal cords, there is a superior pair of vocal cords, false vocal cords, or vestibular ligaments they're also called. They have no function in the production of sound. They act as mechanisms to close entrance to the larynx. So in conjunction with the epiglottis, they would help close up the entrance to the larynx. Here we have a sagittal section of the larynx showing you some of the structures I've just been speaking about. So anteriorly here we have the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage. There's the epiglottis that will close up over the entrance to the larynx and prevent material entering. As well as the epiglottis, the false vocal cords or vestibular cords will also close the entrance to the larynx if we want to close it up. The true vocal cords, the ones that produce sound, are inferior to the false vocal cords. Notice the attachment of these cords to these cartilage pairs at the back. The Rytenoid Cartilage is indicated here. When you are, for example, talking, making sound in the larynx, these will pivot and be moved by the muscles that are involved in producing sound. And we'll show you that in just a minute. I've got a little video that will run that will show you this cartilage structure here pivoting around, and you'll be able to see the vocal cords moving, the glottis, the opening of the larynx, getting wider and narrower as sound is produced. So it gives you a bit of an idea of how the system functions. This shows an image of the larynx. The glottis is here, that's the opening, and just either side of that here we have the vocal cords, the ones that produce sound. And you can see how the diameter of the glottis will increase or decrease as sound is being produced, and you'll see these cords vibrating as sound comes through them. I'll get that happening now. So as the air passes through the glottis, it will vibrate these true vocal cords, producing sound. Inferior to the larynx we have the trachea, commonly referred to as the windpipe. It's a flexible tubular structure extending from cervical vertebra number 6 to the thoracic vertebra, around about the border between thoracic vertebra number 4 and 5, going through the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. It's anterior to the esophagus and inferior to the larynx. The walls of the trachea are reinforced by cartilage. So in the larynx we had cartilage reinforcing the walls there. The cartilage also reinforces the walls of the trachea. In the trachea we have about 16 to 20 ring-shaped structures. Well, they're not actually ring-shaped, they're more C-shaped. They're not a complete ring, they're an incomplete ring, more of a C-shape. The hyaline cartilage will provide rigidity to the tracheal walls to make sure the trachea remains open or patent at all times. So it's flexible, allows movement to occur, and that's important when the esophagus is having a big lump of food coming through. It'll push against the trachea. However, there's enough stiffness in the cartilage to keep the airways open at all times. The cartilage rings are connected with one another by elastic ligaments. This shows the basic anatomy of the trachea. We can see here it's inferior to the larynx, and it's reinforced by C-shaped segments of hyaline cartilage. Has a consistency of stiff rubber. Here we have a section, a transverse section of trachea, and the yellow material there, that area there that's been stained, that is the cartilage. So as I mentioned before, it's not a complete ring, it's an incomplete ring, or you could call it also a C-shaped segment of cartilage. It reinforces the airways so they stay open at all times. Notice the location of the esophagus here, posterior to the trachea. The edges of the cartilage, where the limits of it are, you'll get those linked together by a small strip of smooth muscle. And inferior to the trachea, we divide into the left and right primary bronchi, which will then head into the lungs. Inferiorly, the trachea links with the bronchial tree. That's a highly branched system of air-conducting passages. The first of these, which branch off from the trachea, are the left and right primary bronchi. Primary bronchi will then extend further towards the lungs. They'll divide into smaller and smaller segments, and you'll go from primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi, and so on. With that branching, the branches become more numerous, but the diameter of the branches become smaller. You will also have hyaline cartilage supporting the walls of the bronchi. However, rather than the nice C-shaped segments that we saw in the trachea, the cartilage here tends to be more like incomplete plates. And eventually, as the airways get smaller and smaller, the cartilage will disappear. An interesting fact, at the first of the bronchi that we see, the right primary bronchus is shorter, wider and more vertically orientated than the left primary bronchus. Here we can see a diagram of the bronchial tree. These are the bronchi within the lungs. This is where the rest of the lung tissue has been removed just to show the bronchi. Now think of a tree with a single trunk, and as we get higher up the tree, the first large branches appear, then more numerous branching is evident, but as the branches become more numerous, the size of those branches becomes smaller. So you go a big single trunk, a couple of thick branches, many smaller branches, and eventually a large number of very small diameter twigs. So that's the tree analogy here. If you turn this structure upside down, it kind of looks like a tree. So that's the reference to the bronchial tree. Here we have the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus, which are the ones that diverge from the trachea. Notice how the right primary bronchus is a bit wider and more vertically orientated than the left one. It's not just a mirror reflection of each other. So we will talk in detail more about why these differences occur. The key thing to note is you start with a couple of primary bronchi, then you get secondary bronchi, and then smaller and smaller tertiary bronchi. These little grey things here, they're representing reinforcing cartilage. They become far less prominent the smaller the airway structure becomes. On each side, the primary bronchi enter a part of the lung we refer to as the hilum. The term hilum will pop up a few times in this unit. It's basically an indented region. We saw the hilum when we looked at the spleen previously, an indented region where the arteries and veins were entering the structure. It's a similar thing going on here. You have this indented region where the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves can enter. As the bronchial tree projects into the lungs, we get more and more branching. Each primary bronchus, there are two of those, one left and one right, branch into several secondary or lobar bronchi. The left lung will have two secondary bronchi because it has two main lobes. That's two main parts to itself. The right lung is bigger than the left lung. It has three lobes, three segments, and therefore it has three secondary bronchi. Each bronchus will service one of the segments, one of the lobes. Secondary bronchi then continue to divide into tertiary or segmental bronchi. The branching will then continue, become more and more numerous. The airway diameters will get smaller and smaller, and eventually you get microscopic airway structures we refer to as bronchioles. Now the airways are well and truly within the lungs. So we'll stop for a second and consider the gross anatomy of the lungs. The lungs are paired cone-shaped structures that sit upon the thoracic diaphragm. They have a superior region referred to as the apex or cupula that can be found posterior to the clavicle. The lungs are bordered by the thoracic wall to the front, the back, and the sides. And the lungs are separated from each other by the mediastinum. Now, an important concept to remember is that the right and left lungs are not identical. There are significant differences in the anatomy of each of the lungs. In particular, your right lung is slightly larger than the left lung. It contains three distinct segments or lobes. We have a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. Each of the lobes are separated by a groove-like structure that we call a fissure. We have an oblique fissure and a horizontal fissure. Horizontal fissure separates the superior and middle lobes. The oblique fissure separates the middle and inferior lobes. Contrast the anatomy of the right lung with that of the left lung. The left lung is noticeably smaller than the right lung. It consists of only two lobes, a superior and inferior lobe, separated by a single fissure, an oblique fissure. Notice also the cardiac notch. This is the region adjacent to the apex of the heart. At the medial aspect of each of the lungs, you will find the hilum, this indented region which allows access for blood vessels, arteries, and veins, and also the bronchi, nerves, and lymphatics will enter via the hilum. So as we saw with the spleen, the hilum allows structures to enter that particular organ, and here the indented region, the hilum, allows that same sort of thing. Blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, and airways entering via the hilum on each of the lungs at their medial aspects. This is an important concept. The lungs are lined by a double layered membrane. It's what we call a serous membrane. Double layered structure. There is a cavity between the two layers, and in that layer is fluid. This allows the particular organ, in this case the lungs, to be anchored in position, but the cavity between the layers of the membrane contain the lubricating fluid, which facilitates movement because the lungs are constantly moving as you breathe. The type of membrane we have that lines the lungs is what we call a serous membrane. As I mentioned before, it's a double layered membrane. The layer of the membrane that lines the lungs is called the visceral pleura. There is then an outer layer which is continuous with this visceral layer called the parietal pleura. It lines the internal thoracic walls, the lateral regions of the medius sternum, and also the superior diaphragm. There is a space between the membrane layers we call the pleural cavity, and there is serous fluid. It's like a serumy type fluid that acts as a lubricant, ensuring minimal friction during breathing. So you have this setup. The membrane acts as an anchoring structure, helping to anchor the lungs in their position, but because you have this fluid in a cavity, it's a very low friction environment and makes it much easier to breathe. This image shows the pleural membranes that surround the lungs. There is a layer that is in direct contact with the lungs themselves. That is referred to as the visceral layer. This then folds back on itself at the hilum and also becomes the outermost layer. That is the parietal pleura. So the key thing is to remember that these two layers, the parietal and visceral pleural layers, are actually continuous with one another. They help to anchor the lung to the surrounding structures. Notice how between the visceral and the parietal layers there's a cavity. This cavity contains fluid in it, pleural fluid. That acts like a lubricating material that reduces friction during breathing. Over here, I'll explain what this is all about. This is the fist-in balloon structure. This is an analogy with the pleural membrane. Imagine this layer here, the visceral pleura, being the layer of this balloon that is in direct contact with the person's hand. The person's hand is like the lung itself, wrapped by one of those layers. Then you'll notice that this structure here, this membrane, then links back over and becomes the outer layer of the balloon. It's all continuous with the layer that's touching the hand. That's similar to what's going on here. This layer here is continuous with that layer here. It's just as this region here is continuous with the layer of the balloon that's in contact with the hand. There is a space between the layers, as there is over here, and that space in the lung is filled with lubricating pleural fluid. It's very important that this membrane is not ruptured and air does not enter the structure. If you do in detailed physiology, they'll talk about the importance of maintaining negative pressure in this cavity to keep the lung closely associated with the thoracic cavity wall. If the pleural membrane is ruptured, then air has the potential to enter the cavity. This will cause the lungs to collapse, and ventilation will be impossible. So here, this poor individual here has received a penetration wound. It's ruptured the pleural membrane, and unfortunately the elastic tissue has caused the lungs to recoil. So the person now has to have positive ventilation to get air into them. The final structure I'll talk about now is the respiratory zone structures, the gas exchange structures. The airways will eventually terminate at microscopic structures we call alveoli. These are clusters of hollow spheres, the sites of gas exchange, about 300 million per person. They're lined with flattened epithelial cells, and what's very important is that there are many capillaries lining the epithelial cells of the alveoli. This creates a huge surface area to facilitate gas exchange. It's what we call the respiratory membrane. So if we took all these alveoli out, flattened them out, we would have about 50 to 100 meters of area across which gas could be exchanged. This figure here represents the alveoli. Notice that we have the airways here, a microscopic airway we call the bronchiole, it terminates in this cluster of hollow spheres. These are the alveoli. They're composed of thin epithelial cells. Those are interlaced with numerous capillaries, and it is here where the gas exchange occurs. Oxygen is able to diffuse into the bloodstream from the air, and waste carbon dioxide is removed via the same mechanism. Notice also the blood vessels that are associated. Here we've got the pulmonary artery delivering deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and when it's oxygenated it returns back to the heart via pulmonary veins. I'll finish this lecture with a short animation that gives some of the functional descriptions for the way the alveoli operate. So I'll start running that now. What we have here is a cast of the lungs, which is made and then the airways are just left behind. They remove all the rest of the tissue, leaving just the airways. So this is now showing you the microscopic airways and the alveoli. This is representing the alveoli, hollow clusters of cells interspersed with lots and lots of blood vessels. And what we'll be doing in a second is taking a look inside this, and we'll see the process of gas exchange occurring. So, hollow spheres of cells, the alveoli. There's a bronchiole, the air going through there, and now we have the respiratory membrane. See the adjacent capillary? Air is entering here. We have different gas molecules. That might be nitrogen there. That's oxygen. The white one is what we're interested in, white oxygen molecules. High density of those in the air. By diffusion, those oxygen molecules, some of them will diffuse into the bloodstream and therefore be delivered to the cells of the body. At the same time, carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cellular metabolism, will be transported by the bloodstream, and when it gets to the alveoli, it will be able to diffuse back into the air. So gas exchange occurring in the alveoli, the interface between the air and the bloodstream. And that concludes today's lecture.